After years of playing Slay the Spire on Steam, I, amazingly, have completely overlooked the Vacant. I played it for the first time recently, and have grinded the character on Ascension 20, putting over 30 hours into them. The Vacant is a fantastic character created by Logic, or Logic, I'm not really sure how to say your name, sorry, and you can play it right now from the Steam Workshop. During those 30 hours, I've accumulated several Corrupt Heart kills on Ascension 20, and I have thoughts regarding the Vacant's card pool, so I'll be sharing them here. Note that this tier list is specifically for Ascension 20 with defeating the Corrupt Heart as the main goal. Also, this tier list is specifically for version 1.1.3.1 of the mod, so keep in mind parts of it may become less relevant later if Logic decides to update it. The tier list isn't in any specific order, the card placement is entirely random, but I do want to note that Vacant does have a lot of keywords, so if you aren't familiar with this character, it might be a little difficult to follow. So I'll quickly cover the main keywords. I would argue that Vacant's main gimmick is the mill keyword. The description sounds scary, eerily similar to Scry, but I promise it's much more fun than Scry. Mill simply puts the top X cards from your draw pile into your discard pile, X being the number after the word mill shows up on cards. Mill won't shuffle the deck, so mill makes it very easy to end up with 0 cards in your draw pile. This will be important later. Ricochet is another prominent keyword. If a card has Ricochet, milling it will put it into your hand rather than your discard pile. As a result, mill can be used as, effectively, targeted card draw. If a card has the return keyword, that just means the top card of your discard pile is going back into your hand. If you do have 0 cards in your draw pile at any point, your Void buff becomes active. Vacant's starter relic gives you 2 Void at the start of combat. Void is basically strength and dexterity that is only active if you have an empty draw pile, or it's always active for cards that have the Void-bound keyword. Besides that, Vacant introduces Temperance, which is the exact same as Vigor, but for block cards rather than damage cards. Antifact, the opposite of Artifact, which prevents you from gaining buffs. Some Vacant cards have the Hello keyword, which means the effect is only active if you have half health or less, or if you have a debuff of any kind. Vacant can also mine gems, which are essentially orbs that give you a passive effect at the start of your turn. Gems have a certain size, each turn their size reduces by 1, and if the size hits 0, it goes away. Some cards allow you to chip gems to reduce their size immediately, effectively giving you the benefits now rather than later. And Doom, a debuff applied to enemies that is essentially strength against that enemy specifically. Speaking of Doom, let's kick off the tier list with Doomed, which is a perfectly acceptable Act 1 pickup. It has the highest base damage for a common attack card, and applies the Doom debuff to all enemies, with the trade-off that you also get Doom for the turn, which basically means that everyone is going to take more damage per hit. The Doom debuff isn't that bad until Act 2, when enemies start to hit multiple times, and Vacant likes to get debuffed anyway, because many of their cards synergize with debuffs. I don't pick this card as often as I probably should, but this is a decent one. I'd put it in C tier. I'm sorry, but Threaten just isn't a good card. It literally does nothing unless you have Strength or Vigor, and although Vacant has many ways to gain Vigor, Vigor isn't really a way to scale, so it's really hard to justify taking this. I would consider it if I find an early Akabeko, but that's about it. D tier. Pickaxe is a bit better. It does decent damage regardless of whether or not you have Strength/Vigor, and that chip keyword lets you cash in the benefits of gems immediately, which could be useful for sure. I think this card is outclassed by most attacks, including its counterpart Gilded Pickaxe, but it's still fine. I think it deserves the same tier as Doomed. Battle Scars is not good at all. 4 Vigor is insulting when you already start with a 0-cost card that gives you 3 Vigor and does damage immediately. If you're Hollow, you can gain Temperance as well, but the other unique card you start with also gives you Temperance and is much more reliable. This has to be a contender for worst card in the mod. If you have a decent amount of mill in your deck, it's pretty likely that you are going to mill past your important power cards. It needs an upgrade pretty desperately, but if you get it, Unearth is the absolute best way to mitigate this. If you have the Tombstone Relic, Unearth is effectively a 1-cost Seek. Very powerful, lots of utility, A tier. There are only 2 cards that have been present in every single run that I recorded for this video, and Treasure is one of them. At face value, this is a card that effectively says, next turn, draw an extra card and gain 1 energy, which I would consider very strong by itself. But because this happens in the form of gems, it has so much more utility than that. You can use the card Polish to keep the benefit going for another turn. You can use either of the pickaxe cards to get the benefit immediately. You can use Enchant to give the gems powers to one of your cheap cards, etc. If you are creative, you can do some really silly things with Treasure. In fact, this card is so good that even 1 or 2 upgraded copies completely removes your need for an energy relic. Easy S tier. Cower isn't horrible, in fact it's quite good, especially if you have access to lots of temperance, but Vacant just has way better methods of gaining block most of the time. The fact that I'm about to place this card so low is really a testament to how strong this character is. I'd put it in C tier. Brass Magnet isn't good in a vacuum, but it has one of the highest potentials for synergy in the mod. You can use a return card to get it back into your hand for some very easy burst damage, and obviously if you're milling a ton, this will provide loads of damage as well. A tier. Any amount of synergy with this card will allow you to steamroll the early game and can be relevant even later on. Generally speaking, one of the most reliable strategies as the Vacant is to thin your deck down enough to increase the ratio of ricochet and mill cards. You can do this out of combat by removing cards, or you can do this in combat with some cards such as Desperation. Even if you don't want to exhaust any cards, you can use this to play powers for free because they effectively exhaust anyways. Great utility, A tier. Partake offers really impressive block numbers for a 0-cost card, and the weakness portion isn't that bad, because Vacant often enjoys debuffs anyway. B tier. From Nothing is one of the most reliable tools that Vacant has. It lets you get any card of your choosing out of the draw pile, in addition to any other card that has the Ricochet keyword, which can set up some really devastating turns for the enemy. I really like using this to put the Ricochet keyword onto 0-cost cards, such as Treasure, for vastly increased value during fights. The only downside is that if it's in the bottom half of your draw pile, the card is kind of sad, but even then it's usable. S tier. Now seems like a good time to talk about the Void buff. Similar to Vigor, I don't consider Void to be something that you could reliably build around as a win condition. Most of the time it's only relevant if you have an empty draw pile, which admittedly is easier to achieve with Mill, but even with that, you'd be surprised at how often you end up reshuffling the draw pile, rather than ending up at 0 cards in it for Void to kick in. All that to say, cards that give you Void really aren't that good, especially if they don't have the Ricochet keyword. Cursed Blast is a C tier card. Shrieking Blast is another C tier card. It's just alright. If you need a quick AoE solution for the early game, this will serve just fine. It does fall off really hard later. All Man is one of those cards that are bad by itself, but becomes crazy good with synergies. 0-cost cards that apply debuffs to you are actually quite good, even with Doom being a particularly bad debuff. The Ruby Gem is a bit underwhelming, but Onyx can be a good way to scale against enemies, even if it is slow. A tier. I love 0-cost cards with the Ricochet keyword, and thankfully one exists in the starting deck, Soul Bash. This is just a very solid attack card, at least early on. Very reliable, B tier. Because Hollow kind of rewards you for being at low health, I often want to stay at low health. Recover compromises that for the next fight, and in my opinion isn't worth the energy and draw to play. Might be a hot take, but I think this is a D tier card. Lash Out can be a run saver, sometimes. As I mentioned, the way I play Vacant is that I'm not afraid to stay at low health levels, meaning Lash Out often deals at least 35 or so damage for 1 energy, absolutely slaying Act 1 and 2 enemies and elites. Lash Out isn't a scaling card, but the front load is phenomenal. Sometimes this card is the excuse you need to smith at a rest site rather than rest. B tier. On any other character, Sapphire Strike would be great. Unfortunately for Vacant, a reliable way of gaining Temperance already exists in the starting deck, and also, Sapphire gems aren't usually worth the gem slot, in my opinion. Additionally, the low damage on this card isn't enough to save it, gotta put it at D tier. Dig is a very solid card. Nice block gain, and it usually gets at least 1 other card into your hand, if not 2 or more. If it comes with a free upgrade, I'll usually take it regardless of which stage of the game I am in. High B tier. Similar to Desperation, Memoria is a way to thin your deck down, but I actually think the best use of this card is playing power cards twice. Vacant has some very good powers that usually win fights on their own, but even more so when doubled. A tier. Milling is very powerful, but that doesn't mean all mill cards are good. Sneeze falls into that category. The competition is just too fierce, as you're going to see with the next card. D tier. I won't stall on this. Fling is absolutely high S tier. One of the biggest breakthroughs during my time with the Vacant is when I realized just how amazing Fling is. I mean, look at this beautiful upgrade. This card offers fantastic front load and is one of the best sources of mill in the entire mod. We do need to discuss that middle portion though, the dizzy gain. I avoided Fling for an embarrassingly long time because I assumed dizzy was much worse than it actually is. Dizzy gives you more options next turn, but your first 3 cards are face down. There are 2 massive parts of Dizzy that aren't stated in the keyword's description though. First of all, the game shows you what cards are face down, which drastically helps your decision making. And secondly, you can often kind of tell which cards are which by selecting the card, but not playing it. If the card has a target indicator, it's probably an attack or one of the few skills that allow targeting. You can use this to identify face-down cards pretty reliably. Though I would consider Dizzy to be more or less a neutral effect, the game counts it as a debuff, which is huge for activating Hollow or incrementing debuff counts for cards such as Darkstrike. Fling could easily be a rare card, but it's a common. It being a common also lets you pick multiple copies up, so you can pull off some crazy combos with it. I could keep going about how amazing this card is, but you get the point. One of the best synergies with Fling is Jab. If you have a decent amount of mill in your deck, Jab can contribute lots of damage every turn. I really love adding 2 or 3 copies of Jab to the deck and just spamming attacks constantly, which is fantastic for contributing to relics such as Ornamental Fan or Shuriken. The fact that it goes back into your draw pile when played does have 2 consequences though, one good and one bad. The bad part is that it can negate your Void. The good part is that if you're doing Fling shenanigans, you'll likely end up with Jab at the top of your draw pile pretty often, which is one of the best cards to have face down because it's a free attack. A tier. With Relic synergy, this is better than Brass Magnet, otherwise I'd say it's slightly worse. Great card either way though. Rejection is one of those cards that become harder to take the later on in the run you are. 5 strength is great for Act 1, but isn't enough to carry you through the rest of the acts. Additionally, this card gives you Anti-Fact, which is really bad. Anti-Fact can negate important effects such as powers that you play, but in Act 1 you're probably not going to have too many power cards, which is why it's best there. C tier. I don't pick this card too often, but it's a desperate solution for Act 1 threats. I talked about Void cards earlier, so you already know my thoughts on them. Blaze does come with the Voidbound keyword, but that's not nearly enough to keep it from the D tier. You often want to get rid of strikes as fast as possible on this character, especially when such excellent common attacks such as Fling and Brass Magnet exist. Pretty obvious D tier. I actually quite like Eye Poke, I just often can't justify adding it to my decks. It's hard to put into words, but it never quite fits into what I'm trying to do. The damage is negligible, and weak isn't something that will have a huge impact on damage mitigation for Vacant specifically, so I have to put this into C tier. For a character that has both Vigor and Temperance, having both block and damage in one card is nice, and Opal Fracture provides that in addition to an Opal Gem. I do think Treasure is a better source of Opal, but Opal Fracture is acceptable as well. High B tier. Thoughtseize. Pretty sure those were the bad guys in World War II. Genuinely fantastic card, especially when upgraded. I would argue it's the best return card in the entire mod. One of the best uses for this is getting back zero-cost cards, such as Treasure or Brass Magnet, for lots of immediate value. A tier. If I'm looking to apply Doom to enemies, Hex is the card I usually pick. The Doom that it provides is effectively 3 strength against one enemy, meaning it's fantastic for the Act 1 boss in particular. And the Hollow condition makes it fantastic for the rest of the game too against multi-hit attacks. However, if I'm running a deck that doesn't rely on Doom and my block is already strong, this is not really something I'll usually pick. Kinda fits the definition for a B tier card. Defends are surprisingly good on Vacant thanks to the Temperance buff. 1 defend can easily be 10 or more block even without an upgrade. They're still bad cards because cards such as Dig and Where the Goblet exist, but they're not as bad as strikes. C tier. Ruby Rage. Why would I pick this card when such an amazing Vigor generator already exists in my starting deck? D tier. Delve into Darkness is the first card on this list that gives you Shroud, and let me tell you, Shroud is crazy. The amount of effective block that it gives you is bonkers. Delve into Darkness deserves A tier for being a reusable Shroud source as well as a bit of mill. Slightly underwhelming card if you're not Hollow, though. In a world where Hex exists, Onyx Plaster, and any card that gives you an Onyx gem, really, are weak in comparison. Still a perfectly fine early game pickup, and it's nice that it does Ricochet, to basically guarantee that you start applying Doom as fast as possible. C tier. Here we go. Showdown is my favorite Vacant card. While not immediately obvious, it only stops milling once you hit an attack card that doesn't already have the Ricochet keyword. This is super important, because if you build your deck properly and remove those pesky starter strikes, Showdown can easily mill half or even more of your draw pile for free. My favorite Vacant run, which I'll talk more about later, was one where I abused 2 copies of Showdown to go infinite and apply ludicrous amounts of Doom to enemies, killing them in a single hit, oftentimes on turn 1. Oddly enough, I'd argue that the upgrade for Showdown actually makes it worse, so that's a potential downside to the card. But it's still an absolute beast, even if you don't necessarily build around it. Might be biased because the card is so much fun to use, but I'll sneak it into S tier. One of the potential downsides to gems is that you usually have to wait until the following turn to take advantage of their effect. Reach Through lets you have immediate and future benefits from gems, which is incredibly strong with the Emerald, Opal, and Diamond gems in particular. However, 3 Anti-Fact is terrifying if you don't have any way to mitigate it. Very strong effect with a potentially run-ending downside. I gotta put it into B tier. Speaking of gems, From the Depths allows you to duplicate gems. This can be very powerful, and the card is still acceptable even if you don't have any gems. Good base damage and scales twice with Strength and Vigor. B tier. When I first started playing the Vacant, I was under the assumption that I would put Frantic Blow into S tier. This card is basically a better Wallop if you are Hollow, and there are a lot of ways to become Hollow in Vacant through cards or even a Speed or Flex Potion since those apply temporary debuffs. Even without being Hollow, the damage is still fine for a 2-cost attack card. If you are Hollow, this card is S tier, and if you aren't Hollow, it's still B tier because you can become Hollow later. I'll settle it in the middle at A tier. I mentioned before how Treasure was one of the 2 cards that appeared in every one of my recorded runs. Where the Goblet is the other card. Very often getting 10 block or more for free from a common card is unbelievable, and it pairs super well with Corporeate, the starter card which mills a lot and makes the next block card more effective. This character has some extremely strong common cards, as you can see. S tier. Empty Shield is a lot better if you are Hollow, and staying Hollow is often a good idea. Think of this as an Impervious, basically. A tier. Void Stone makes every attack or block card for the next few turns more effective. I do think I underrate this card a little bit, even though I don't think Void as a mechanic is very strong. But just 2 block twice for 2 energy is laughably bad unless you have Temperance. B tier. Back in the Mine is a card that pairs well with cards such as All Man for multiple reasons. This card offers fantastic AoE damage and is often worth playing even if you only have 1 gem. B tier. Diamond is Unbreakable is not only a bold claim, but also potentially one of the best defensive cards available to the Vacant. The Diamond gem essentially gives you a temporary buffer each turn it's active, which trivializes some fights entirely, such as Transient. You can further enhance this by duplicating the Diamond or polishing it. Needless to say, it's a strong card. If you have the Polishing Rag relic, you could be essentially immortal against enemies who only hit once. A tier. Grave Wave is another ridiculously powerful common card. If you're familiar with high-level Slay the Spire play, you probably know how good the Defects Hologram card is. Grave Wave has the power of Hologram, and it's debatably better because the Vacant's mill mechanic allows you to put many more cards into the discard pile per turn, meaning you have a larger selection. You could argue this is S tier, but I'll just put it into A tier. Burden Break. Again, not a very good card, you already have reliable Vigor gain to start with. D tier. Void Embrace can be decent if you have a reliable mill engine, but if you're milling that much, I have to imagine you're winning anyway, so D tier. The Anvil is a nice damage supplement for decks that have a lot of mill, but not necessarily a lot of AoE damage. The bad part is that this card's damage does not scale, and if you happen to draw it naturally, tough luck, should have milled harder, I guess. B tier. I have no doubt that there is a way to make Topaz Frenzy work as a primary damage source, but I just haven't found it yet. Although you are able to get a lot of block as the Vacant, without a way to retain that block, this card just ends up falling flat most of the time. It is the only way to obtain a Topaz gem, but I don't really think that justifies the rest of the card, especially when you sometimes, debatably, don't want Artifact on this character anyway. Another D tier card. Into the Abyss is better than you'd think, especially when paired with cards that debuff both you and the enemies, such as Showdown, but it's still not amazing. Temperance is nice, but you already have enough access to it with Corporeal. Still, might be worth considering if you are debuffing a lot. C tier. Looking at Exorcise out of context, it seems like a good card. And it is. However, there are other rare cards for the Vacant that prevent debuffs in a more effective way, in my opinion. So this one is just outclassed. Additionally, if you play like I do, you will probably be gaining a lot of Dizzy, and what happens when you try to apply Dizzy to enemies? Literally nothing. C tier. I absolutely would not argue with anyone who says that Forge Soul is the best card in the mod. This is a 1-card damage and block solution that could go into effect extremely quickly if you have even a modest amount of mill. Better yet, if you can mill most of your draw pile at once with cards such as Showdown or From Nothing, you will scale to high heaven. Steel Soul is so much better than you think it is. It lets you take an enemy's strength and artifact, and thanks to that Siphon keyword, if the enemy doesn't have enough, it goes into the negatives for both. Antifact is wildly powerful when applied to enemies. You could argue this is the single best card to use against the Corrupt Heart, as Antifact prevents it from gaining Beat of Death or Strength. Another fun interaction is that you could prevent Nemesis from gaining Intangible. And don't even get me started on what you could do to the poor Transient with this card. Additionally, the damage portion of this card is separate from the X-cost stuff, so you could play it as an emergency damage option even if you have no energy. S tier. I basically take Cleanse Soul every time I see it. Well, just the first copy, at least. This card is so good in any fight where you have a lot of statuses, such as against the Sentries, Slavers, Chosen, and of course Corrupt Heart. As a bonus, it costs 0, so the only real cost is the card draw it takes to play it. And once you exhaust a few status cards, it essentially pays for itself. A tier. Emerald Splash is not only a fantastic attack card in its own right, but it offers great utility as well, thanks to the fact that it mines an emerald gem. The upgrade for this card is unbelievably good as well, and makes it so you draw an extra card for at least the next 2 turns. The common cards in this mod are seriously bonkers good. A tier. If you like Fling and Showdown as much as I do, you will probably also like Dark Strike. Vacant can accumulate lots of debuffs very quickly, and this card absolutely smites enemies. Additionally, it is incredibly powerful with Vigor. It does require a bit of setup though. However, it does have one really bad downside. This card, as well as another card that I will cover later, is glitched, and sometimes won't perform all the hits that it advertises, which seems to happen mostly in multi-enemy fights. This can absolutely screw you over and lose you a game. Would be A tier, but until this is addressed, I have to settle for B tier. Okay, Rift is a Void-related card that I respect. I view this card as Armaments at Home, except Armaments at Home is still pretty good. It essentially upgrades your damage and block cards for the rest of combat. Just grabbing one of these before the Act 1 Guardian fight could be a block solution, for example. This does fall off a little bit later on, though. B tier. Shatter Amethyst is a card that breaks the game. No, I mean literally break the game. This card has soft-locked me multiple times, forcing me to restart fights. At least I assume it's this card, but the soft locks I've experienced have had this as a common denominator. I have to put this at D tier by default. If you have a thin deck and a few copies of Treasure, you can definitely go infinite using Gilded Pickaxe. Decent AoE as well as utility depending on whichever gems you have at the moment. B tier. Gloom attempts to address the problem of missing power cards thanks to milling them away. However, like many good cards in this mod, it's outclassed by even better cards that do the same thing. D tier. Requiem is a fun card, but as for how powerful it is, I'm not too sure. In my experience, the most practical use case for this is with cards such as Showdown to give the enemies permanent doom. There's likely a more creative ways to use this that I have in my time with the Vacant, but for me this is a B tier card. Similarly, Dimension Tear sounds good in theory, but then you look at Vacant's card pool and realize that only a few of their really good cards exhaust, so it's tough to use Dimension Tear reliably. I just don't think this is ever worth picking over other rare cards. D tier. Polish is a must-have if you're running a gem-based deck. I love the synergy with Treasure. You can build up a gem stash and consistently have massive turns thanks to this card. A tier. With how many times you can play zero-cost attacks per turn as the Vacant, Reaper Strike can heal a significant amount of HP every time you use it. This card is genuinely excellent, and a single copy of this justifies taking Coffee Dripper for me. S tier. Corporeate is a beautiful starter card, and especially when upgraded, as it mills 7 cards, a huge number for the early game. It often contributes a lot to your block plan as well, thanks to the temperance it gives, not to mention that sweet return keyword, which means this card is almost always useful. B tier. Remember that run I mentioned before, where I went infinite with double Showdown? That was only possible because of Runic Thoughts. This card is comically overpowered, and could easily be 2 or 3 more cards per turn in your hand, effectively. Plus, it enables easy infinites, especially when paired with another card that I'm going to address shortly. S tier. Spelunk is fine, not great, not terrible, not much to say about this one. B tier. Enchant is so busted. You can make your own zero-cost cards that draw like 5 cards and give you about 10 energy. This card is exactly why I'm extra critical of gems that aren't Emerald or Opal. Having one of those 2 gems in the frontmost position so you can enchant a card with those effects is huge. Such an easy way to go infinite if you're creative with it. The only issue is that it's slow. You first need to obtain the gems you want, make sure they're in the right position. Then you need to draw enchant at the same time as one of the cards that you want to use enchant on. High A tier. Acceptance is quite good. That secondary effect with drawing cards upon losing artifact is very strong. It's just kind of expensive to play, but if you can play it, you're usually happy. B tier. Immaterialize is arguably the best defensive card in this mod. If you are doing Fling plus Jab plus Brass Magnet shenanigans, your passive block gain is going to be astronomical. You need this card if you have even a small amount of mill and ricochet synergy going on. S tier. Void form is an interesting one. As much as I don't like Void, 5 Void is quite a lot, and the passive mill each turn does make it easier to take advantage of that Void. This card does have 2 big downsides. First is the high upfront cost, and second is that the passive mill will often put your important cards in the discard pile. So ideally you'll either stall on playing Void form, or have some way to fish out those cards. Pretty good card overall. A tier. Cracked Reflection seemed weak to me until I realized how powerful Fling is, and that absolutely opened my eyes to Cracked Reflection as well. Just 1 copy of this power can be responsible for loads of card draw and energy per combat, thanks to duplicating powerful gems such as those granted by Treasure. Additionally, even though those gems only have a size of 1, you can keep them alive by using Polish, and at that point you've basically won whatever fight you're in. S tier, with the caveat that you need Fling and or Treasure before picking this. Essence of Bismuth is what I would consider a win more card. It's very good, but if you're in a situation where doubling or tripling when upgraded debuffs is going to win you the fight, I assume you are probably going to win that fight anyway. Very fun card though, maybe B tier. Spin Shield is an excellent source of block, and I do mean excellent because it scales so well with Temperance, and it gives you Dizzy, which debatably isn't even a negative effect. However, I find that blocking isn't really an issue on Vacant, so this card, like many others, is outclassed. Still great though. B tier. Soul Barrage is another card that is glitched and occasionally won't perform all the hits that you would expect, severely hindering its usefulness. Otherwise, this card is fantastic. Great scaling with Vigor, and you have a built-in Chemical X if you are Hollow. Gotta put this at B tier, would be A tier probably if it weren't glitched. And finally, Reaper Blast. More like Reaper outclassed, am I right? No, but seriously, it's not that great. Reaper Strike is just better. D tier, but it is a high D tier for what that's worth. That concludes the list. I hope it taught you something. Basically, the main takeaways are, take Fling, upgrade it, and build around it. I'd love to know your thoughts on Vacant's cards in the comments, and I'm sure that I'm misinterpreting the power of some cards, and I'm definitely up for discussion. One more thing. I just updated my curated challenges mod with some new Vacant exclusive challenges, so if you're looking for an excuse to jump back into the character, perhaps this is it. And that's it. If you've watched this whole video, thank you so much. Comments are always appreciated, and let me know what you want to see next. Bye.